Climate change, the pandemic, war and conflict, inflation, and the cost of living are all contributing factors to the increasing fragility of our food security. I'm Dan Murphy, and in this edition of Equity and Opportunity, we explore the work of Community Jameel, the organisation using real data and science to tackle poverty around the world. Community Jameel was founded by one of Saudi Arabia's most prominent families in business, the Jameels, led by Mohammed Jameel and his sons Fadi and Hassan. Through a variety of initiatives and collaborations with academic institutions, the organisation promotes the use of science, data, and technology to help solve what it describes as pressing human challenges and to support governments in evidence-based policymaking. Among Community Jameel's many initiatives are the Jameel Clinic, based at the acclaimed Massachusetts Institute of Technology, better known as MIT, where scientists use AI to discover a new antibiotic, halicin, in 2020. And the Jameel Observatory, which uses data science to mitigate the severe impacts of climate change and to protect food systems in the world's most vulnerable regions. To discuss more about Community Jameel's commitment to eradicating poverty, I sat down with the organisation's director, George Richards, in Dubai. So George, how would you characterise the scale of global poverty in 2022?
I think that there are new challenges which are exacerbating already existing systemic problems around poverty. Of course, the pandemic. This is a major challenge. And there is also, I think, through climate change, growing pressures on people around the world, especially the poorest people, for example, around their food security. One of the things that we did actually as Community Jameel early on in the pandemic, so this is 2020, was we saw that there would be a long-term impact from the pandemic on people's lives. And so we worked with JPAL to launch a new regional office for Middle East North Africa region, which is in Cairo, with the mandate of course, trying to lift people out of poverty in general, but particularly focused on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic.
And it might seem like a simple question, but why is it important to address an issue like poverty? Of course, putting malnutrition to one side, we know poverty also has a significant impact on societies and on economies. What's being done to address that, and why is it important to address?
When we think about the ultra poor, the poorest people in society, it's always been a challenge for governments and for charities and philanthropies to find effective mechanisms to lift those people out of poverty, or help them lift themselves out of poverty, and not almost wash one's hands and consign them to multi-generational poverty. And so for us, it's always been, when we come from a region which has such great potential, we really want to make sure that there are fixes, there are interventions, initiatives that can be effective, whether it's, for example, in education. Education is a great tool for unlocking human potential and helping people escape poverty. So how can we make sure that education is effective as possible? Nutrition is another example, social protection another. And I think taken in the round, all of these mechanisms can be effective at lifting people out of their poverty.
Of course, one of the other major challenges today, not just as a result of the war in Ukraine, but other factors, is this critical challenge of addressing global food security. What is Community Jameel doing in the area of food security today, and how important is this issue?
And the Jameel Observatory uses data to monitor, forecast, and give early warnings of outbreaks of hunger in the communities of Eastern Africa, with the goal of allowing communities themselves, but also governments, to take early action, what they call forecast-based action or anticipatory action, and get ahead of these oncoming outbreaks of hunger, and so prevent them escalating to the worst possible crisis that they could be. The Jameel Observatory uses a very wide range of data, from remote sensing and satellite imagery down to household economic data, literally how much does a family spend on its food, in order to build a complex model which hopefully allows us to understand when the pressures are coming, whether it's from climate change, for example, droughts might be increasing in severity and frequency because of climate change. And the Jameel Observatory, we ultimately hope, will have an important impact, but Just a few months ago, the Jameel Observatory collaborated with Save the Children and Oxfam to publish a report called Dangerous Delay 2, which comes 10 years after a previous report called Dangerous Delay, when there was a last major famine in Eastern Africa. And unfortunately, not enough has been done in practical terms to allow for anticipatory action in the face of famine. And moreover, that there is a crisis now in Eastern Africa such that every 48 seconds, a person is likely dying of acute hunger. So we have to act now. We also have to build systems with research, with data, that would allow us to act more smartly in the future and hopefully save more lives. This is one area in response to the growing food insecurity around the globe. The other is called the Jameel Index. And this was launched just the other week, actually, by the Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, working with a consortium of partners, including in Ethiopia, in Washington, D.C., even here in the UAE at United Arab Emirates University, to use data and build models that understand how trade vulnerabilities can impact food security, and ultimately to inform governments and other stakeholders how they can mitigate those risks. And I think that's another a challenge that we're seeing compounded by conflict, as you mentioned, but also from climate change and other pinch points in the global supply chain, whether it's the pandemic's impact or we saw the blockage of the Suez Canal last year. And so the Jameel Index, we hope, will provide a valuable resource for decision makers in trying to strengthen resilience in the face of trade vulnerabilities and food security.
When it comes to food security, I've spoken with experts who say that this is a crisis not just of accessibility, but of affordability. It's not the fact that there isn't food out there for people, it's the fact that people can't afford that food. How do you address a challenge around pricing?
I think these two questions of food security and poverty are deeply interlinked. If we can address food insecurity, for example, through cash payments, and that's one of the tools that the Jameel Observatory is using in Eastern Africa, in order to understand how best and how most effectively to stave off the challenge of food security, particularly among the most vulnerable, whether it's pastoralists who might not be have as strong access to financial security. This is exactly the kind of work that Jameel Observatory is doing, and moreover, which J-PAL's participation in the Jameel Observatory allows us to test and evaluate scientifically so that we can produce evidence that informs other stakeholders as they design mechanisms to tackle food insecurity at the nexus of food insecurity and poverty.
Are you concerned that poverty might become more widespread, particularly in developed economies, as we see this multitude of issues continue to play out here?
Definitely. I think that the food insecurity challenges that we see, for example, in Eastern Africa or the Middle East, North Africa region, they might be acute in those parts of the world now, but there's nothing necessarily to prevent these spreading to all parts of the globe, including the global north. And actually, the work of the Jameel Index is global, and it's taking a global view and looking to inform governments, including in North America, in Europe, and so on. And likewise, the Jameel Observatory, we have a global ambition for the project, and hopefully we'll be able to work with governments around the world to ensure that data and evidence is used to inform policy making, as I said, not just in the global south, but also in the global north.
Coming up, navigating post-pandemic challenges.
The pandemic pretty much has been a big setback for us, whether you look at inflation, whether you're looking at living standards worldwide. The poor and vulnerable have been the hardest hit, especially those living in low, middle and income countries.
Welcome back to Equity and Opportunity, and to Dubai, where I met George Richards, Director of Community Jameel, the organisation leveraging science and technology to tackle a number of global humanitarian issues, including poverty. One of Community Jameel's initiatives is the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or J-PAL, which launched in 2003. Although based at MIT, in collaboration with academic institutions around the world, researchers collect data, conduct evaluations, and use it to promote evidence-based social policies that will be effective in eradicating poverty. A testament to the work of the organisation, in 2019, J-PAL's founders Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, along with key collaborator Michael Kramer, were awarded a Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences.
J-PAL has been doing amazing work for nearly 20 years next year is their anniversary. And just the other week, we announced a new round of support for the lab, focused on something called evidence to policy. And this is in collaboration with an organization called Co-Impact as well. Evidence to policy is fundamental to how J-PAL is looking to scale its impact around the world. Already they conservatively estimate to have impacted the lives of, I think, over 400 million people. And they believe that they can do more, and so do we. And the Evidence to Policy initiative is really about finding ways to closer integrate the use of evidence generated from research, from randomized controlled trials, with policymaking. If we can get policymakers out of habit using J-PAL type evidence in order to make their decisions, particularly around key development questions, whether it's access to healthcare, education, poverty alleviation, and social protection, then this is how we believe we can really take J-PAL to even the next level.
J-PAL has regional headquarters in countries around the world, including India. Shobhini Mukerji is the Executive Director for the South Asia region.
Poverty is multidimensional. It's not simply whether people have enough money to meet the basic needs. It's just as important to see whether we have access to proper education, to healthcare, to nutritious food. In India, for instance, and across several parts of South Asia, the mortality rate has dropped significantly, but we still have newborns dying every single minute in India, for instance. The literacy rate has jumped to more than 5 times since our independence in 1947, but it's still well below the world average. And on average, half of the 5th graders in India cannot read a simple sentence. We see this playing out in across many states and even within the region. There are many burning issues that need attention today. For instance, if we think about it, are women and children growing up in an environment that is free from violence and abuse? Are adults able to find jobs? And jobs that are just not there, jobs that sort of best make use of skills and qualifications. We are sort of matching aspirations to outcomes. We made a lot of progress in the last few years in poverty reduction, but COVID, the pandemic, pretty much has been a big setback for us, and we've seen several shocks. Whether you look at the economy, whether you look at inflation, whether you're looking at sort of living standards worldwide, the poor and vulnerable have been the hardest hit, especially those living in low, middle, and income countries.
And as we navigate these issues and challenges, help me understand the ramifications of poverty at a more broad level, including the displacement of communities and the other knock-on effects.
In terms of displacement of communities, across the world, we are seeing that millions of people today live as refugees due to both the climate crisis or political conflict. And millions of others live in areas where we see high levels of internal strife. Fragility, conflict, and violence is a critical development challenge. It's been, by 2030, I think we are looking at more than 2/3 of the world's extreme poor could live in these conflict situations. UNHCR, for instance, estimates that more than 80 million people are going to be forcibly displaced by the end of this 2022, with the vast majority living in low and middle income countries. So I think improved humanitarian programming in such fragile settings must consider an intersectional lens, and it must account for the needs of different disadvantaged subgroups. Whether you look at gender, disability, race, ethnicity, all of them, they'll be impacted by varying degrees of the effect of such a crisis.
The UN has said that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the effects of poverty, pandemics, and climate change. Why do you think that's so?
The research has shown that violence against women and girls has increased, especially during the pandemic. We can see, the pandemic-induced lockdowns have added to economic stress and has diminished women's access to resources and support systems, and sort of let them in sort of neglect and abusive relationships. We've seen a widening gap between the female and male labor force participation rate in the aftermath of the pandemic. A lot less women have rejoined work. Partly also we see that school closures and daycare closures also burden families with additional care and domestic responsibilities, which are primarily shouldered by women.
Away from using data to help eradicate poverty, Community Jameel and its various initiatives fund scientific and technological research into a variety of areas at institutions around the world.
We look to work with academic institutions because we believe they are a great venue for the generation of evidence and data and utilizing it. But it's not just about supporting academic institutions. For us, we want to work with researchers and teams who have a very practical outlook for how they can leverage the work that they're doing to change people's lives. And we've really also benefited from working with universities all around the world. Some of our older collaborations are with universities in the Arab world, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, of course, and how we can find collaborations between research institutions. So last year, we launched a partnership between Imperial College London and King Abdulaziz University in Saudi Arabia to accelerate and really catapult forward new innovations in the treatment and detection of different coronaviruses and other respiratory illnesses. And in the coming days, we will be launching the second round of that collaboration and looking forward to important new discoveries, not only in those two institutions separately, but also together, and building bridges between researchers in, say, the Arab world and in the UK, between the global north and the global south more generally, is a powerful driver for the work that we do.
Let's talk about the issue of climate change as well. Do you think governments globally are doing enough to address this challenge?
We're excited about COP27. We participated in COP26 in Glasgow, and we saw great potential to accelerate some of the work there, and particularly the participation of institutions from the global south and from the Arab world as well. It's interesting to have COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh and COP28 here in the UAE, in Dubai, 2 COPs in a row in the Arab world, and we're excited to hopefully bring in as many of our consortium partners, our community as possible, to put the evidence and the data in front of the key decision makers. I think that the COP conferences are important moments because the eyes of the world and the eyes of the key policymakers are centered on the issue of climate. They're gathered together.
Because the evidence and the data suggest that the governments aren't doing enough at this point to reach climate goals and ambitions. What should they be doing, in your view, particularly as we see these dual climate conferences coming to the region?
We're looking very much at the impact of climate change as it's happening now on people's lives. For example, in Eastern Africa, how the increasing frequency and severity of outbreaks of hunger, of drought, even of famine, how we can help strengthen resilience in the face of this. But also, just more generally, I think that adaptation will increasingly expand into areas of broader human health. So we have to think about air quality, about rising heat. And in fact, there's incredible research being done by Professor Al-Fatih Tahir at MIT, which looks at not just the short-term forecasting of climate change and its impact on adaptation, and we need to act on that, but also 30 years ahead. Can we model climate change and understand what the landscape will look like then? And if so, how can we work with policymakers to start planning to adapt their systems, their countries, for that 30-year horizon climate change impact?
Still ahead on equity and opportunity.
The cost of living crisis, including the impact of energy, I think we're seeing manifesting itself in multiple ways. One of the key areas of focus for us has been the impact of rising fuel prices and inflation on food.
Let's talk about the impact of COVID as well. Obviously, a major global event that's hit reset on a number of major challenges, but vulnerabilities still exist. What would you say are the critical concerns for economies in this part of the world and globally as we continue through the pandemic recovery?
It's likely that this won't be the last outbreak of the pandemic. We haven't seen the end of it, and there could be future flare-ups, and there could be future pandemic diseases or epidemic diseases. One of the interesting tools, powerful tools, that the Jameel Institute at Imperial College London has developed is called Daedalus. The Daedalus tool looks to provide this echo, epidemiological economic modeling together to inform policymakers how best to manage those competing agendas. And I think for us, this is an important tool that will be relevant in the GCC, in the wider Arab world, across the global south, in fact, across the entire world, as we become perhaps living in a new normal where there will be future flare-ups of COVID-19 and of other diseases, and hopefully we can stave off some of the worst economic impacts of managing those diseases. And of course, there were many millions of people who were pushed into poverty as a result of the pandemic, and this will, I think, be a powerful tool for the future.
And vaccine equity was and still is a major issue. What would you say regarding the current state of vaccine equity today? And also, what lessons do you think that the global community, and in particular governments, have learnt through the course of the pandemic about how we could be better prepared and better action future pandemics?
The question of equity in the health space is an acute one. When we look at the vaccine equity question, one of the key questions is around vaccine production, but also research of new vaccines. For example, the importance of collaborations between the users or scientists working in the field of artificial intelligence in healthcare, and collaborators here in the GCC and beyond. One of the early applications of AI during the pandemic was to test existing therapeutic drugs and see whether any of these could be applied against COVID-19. But we know that artificial intelligence has equity challenges. A lot of the populations on which algorithms are tested, for example, in the US, tend to be majority white or Asian, with creating a bias against, for example, black communities in the US. So one of the projects that we're working on with the Jameel Clinic, which is another center at MIT using AI in healthcare, to deploy new AI technologies into clinical settings in collaboration with hospitals, universities, and researchers who can refine and improve the efficacy of these algorithms to the benefit both of the local communities, but also to us all. So I think equity in health, for us at Community Jameel, a key solution is to strengthen research capacity in the region and across the global south.
One of the other critical issues for global markets right now is the energy crisis that we see unfolding through Europe that's having a flow-on effect through the rest of the world, and of course, inflation, the cost of everything continuing to go up. How closely are you watching those twin challenges, and what can an organization like Community Jameel do to help alleviate some of the pressures that we see coming out of those twin challenges?
The cost of living crisis, including the impact of energy, I think we're seeing manifesting itself in multiple ways. One of the key areas of focus for us has been the impact of rising fuel prices and inflation on food. And so I think a key priority for us continues to remain access to food, food security, and whether that's through the Jameel Observatory in Eastern Africa or the new Jameel Index, we're looking to work with governments and communities to ensure that they're able to strengthen their resilience in the face of these shocks to the system when it comes to the supply and access to food.
Organizations like yours are doing a lot, but of course you can only do so much. So what's your message and your advice to world leaders and to policymakers who are also looking at these challenges and looking for solutions?
Absolutely, it is critical that decisions are taken on the basis of evidence and data. And so if there's one message that I think we have at Community Jameel, it's to work with policymakers to ensure that they have access to good, rigorous scientific evidence and data that can inform their responses and their policies when it comes to tackling these great global challenges.
George Richards, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thank you very much.
That's all for this edition of Equity and Opportunity. I'm Dan Murphy in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates. Thanks for watching.